Welcome. A few weeks ago I asked on various social media what kind of videos you would like me to do. And to my big surprise, there was actually quite a lot of people who are asking for very basic videos about how to pick the right clay, center it, and how to throw the most basic forms on the wheel. So today we're going to look at exactly that. I'll show you how to pick the right clay if you're a beginner, and how you can master centering, and how you can throw one of the most basic forms on the wheel, a cylinder. That is like the basic for most other pots that you're going to do, whether it's a vase or a bowl or something, you will usually start out with a cylinder. So that's what we're going to do today. Okay, if you are new to wheel throwing, the first thing you have to consider is what kind of clay you're going to throw with. If you're very unexperienced, most likely, just like I was not so long ago, you're going to do a lot of things that doesn't work out for you. And as clay has a cost, I will suggest that you start out with a clay that, first of all, is relatively easy to throw with, but also is not so expensive. And a good pick for that would be earthenware. I don't do many things in earthenware because of the limitations of it. You can't fire it so high, and there are other things about it. I like stoneware mostly. I do something in porcelain too. Stoneware is also relatively easy to throw with. Porcelain, on the other hand, is a different thing. Most porcelain is much more difficult to throw, but it also has some qualities. It can be very smooth. You can make it very, very thin, if you know how to do that. But it's definitely more difficult. I think most people agree with me on that. So stoneware would be a good place to start your focus, but stoneware is a little more expensive than earthenware. You can get earthenware really, really cheap. So I will suggest, if you're very new to this, start out with earthenware. If you do have a little bit of experience and you think that you are going to do something that is actually going to be useful, then stoneware would be a good place to start. I will suggest that you pick some stoneware that have a decent amount of grog. Grog is these little pieces of burnt clay, basically very, very fine, and it makes the clay a little more stable. It makes it a little easier to throw, especially if you're doing bigger things, but even smaller things, it's a little easy. My favorite one for that sort of thing is from Georg & Schneider, German company. This one, 254. It have 25% grog, the size of 0 to 0.2 millimeter, I think it is. So it's not so much that the clay becomes too rustic. You can still make a pretty plain surface and make it look really nice, but it does make it a little more stable. This is not very expensive. I think in Denmark I pay about 75 kroner per 10 kilos, 7-8 Danish kroner, so what is that? A little more than $1 per kilo. So that is a relatively cheap stoneware. But still, I think it's very nice to work with. The downside is that in a raw bisque-fired version of it, doesn't look so interesting. It does look a little bit, not white, not brown, kind of in between. But glazes actually works really well on it. So if you're working a lot with interesting glazes and textures and stuff, it actually turns out really nice. I've done some great things with this particular clay, and it is very easy to throw with, I think. So that would definitely be type of clay to start out with. Next step is to wedge it. There are two reasons that you want to wedge, like massage your clay before you start using it. First of all, you need to make sure that you get all the bubbles out of the clay. Now again, depending on what kind of clay and the packaging that you get your clay in, there can be different degrees of air bubbles. This particular one is actually really good. There usually is very little or no air bubbles in it. So theoretically, from that point of view, you just cut it out and start throwing it. But there's also another reason, and that is by wedging it, you're kind of aligning the particles in the clay, and that helps when you start throwing it. You can also do some sort of semi-wedging, coning it's called when you throw. I'll show that in a second. But wedging it is a good beginning. So let's move on to my wedging table and I will show you what I do there. So here's my piece of clay. This is the 254 stoneware that I was talking about. I think it's about 4 pounds, 2 kilos. It's probably a little more than what you want to start out with. On the other hand, you don't want to start out with a clay ball that is too small, because I found that it's actually difficult to throw very small balls. Of course, you don't want to go with 5 or 10 kilos or something, at least not to begin with. I picked 2 kilos because it gets a little bigger, it looks better on the video, it's easier to see the details. So that's the one I picked. So I have my wedging table here, which is just really a stone, the ones you put outside in your driveway or something, and I think it was, I don't know, $10 or something, very cheap. And it works really, really well. It doesn't suck up too much of the moisture in the clay, and it's very, very stable. It doesn't move so much, and again, it's very cheap. So there's a million different ways that you can wedge. I'm using for clay ball this size what I think most referred to as a ram's head. I think you can see here kind of shapes like this. And for this kind of clay, it works really well. I move it around, take it from one side to the other side, and then I try and squeeze it in and kind of make it into a ball like this. Now, there's one thing that you've got to keep in mind. No matter how you wedge it, you're going to end up with this sort of spiral here. It would be logical to put it like that and then throw it. Don't do that, because of these spiral shapes, it's much more likely that you're going to get S-cracks in the bottom of your pot. So instead, always do it on the other side. So you do it across the spirals. So I like to pre-shape it into, the kind of ball that fit my hands when I'm going to throw it. I kind of make it a little bit round down here, and then finally I do like this, and that ensures that when I put it on the wheel, it's going to be mashed in here, and it's not going to leave any air bubbles in the bottom. So that's the first step. So let's move on to the wheel. So before I put my clay on the wheel, I put my bat on. I'm using these bats, and I have bat pins on my wheel head. It's not necessary for you. If you don't have a wheel with bat pins or bats, or you don't want to glue it on in other ways, you can also do that with a little bit of layer of clay or with cloth or something. Don't worry about that. I just got used to using bats. It does make it a little more easy when you remove your things, especially if they're very wide. Tall ones or cups, small things are easy enough to remove with your hands, but bigger things easier with a bat. Also, the bat makes it possible to place your pot back on the wheel in exactly the same position, which is, I would say, almost necessary if you do sectional wheel throwing, which is something that I'm going to come back to in another video, hopefully very soon. So before I put my clay on the bat, whether it's with a bat or just right on the wheel head, I just use a damp cloth here and just wet it a little bit. Sponge it is, of course. Not too wet, but just so it's a little damp. That will help the clay glue onto it better. Then I try to throw it down, so get good attachment to the wheel head or the bat, and then I start pre-adjusting it a little bit. So I kind of slap it and move it into a position. You don't have to do that, but I just find that this is relaxing and it's easy, and it makes the centering of the clay ball much easier. Okay, that's good enough for now. The next thing we have to do is center the clay. Doing that, a lot of things can go wrong. What I found is, depending on what kind of bats or wheel head you have, there is a risk that once you start pushing the clay ball, it flies off the bat, which of course you don't want to. So what I found is that it's actually helpful if the first thing you do, I'm just going to dip my hands a little bit in water, is that you seal the corner. If you seal the corner, no water is going to come under it, and that's what happens when it flies off the bat. So now we seal the corner, now we're ready to center it. There's probably as many different ways to center and throw in general as there are potters. I found, a way that works well for me. You can watch a lot of other videos with potters that do it in other ways. It's not so important. The important thing is that before you start forming your clay, you need it to be relatively precise centered, because otherwise it's gonna start shaking and it's gonna get worse and worse, and especially if you do something wide, it's completely impossible. If it's not probably centers. So that's the first thing you have to rehearse. And trust me, I probably went through half a ton of clay before I even got close to mastering the centering. And I can probably still get better at this, but it works okay for me now. So let's move on with that. When you're centering, you can go pretty fast. It's actually nice to do it fast. It kind of helps me in a way. Some people like to do a little bit slower. I'm on the fast side. So, and now as you probably see, I'm doing what I was talking about when we were wedging the clay, what is called coning. So I'm pressing up the clay and I'm pushing it down again. This is also kind of a wedging. Some potters will tell you that you have to do this to align the particles in the clay. I know potters, very, very good, very professional potters that never do it, and it works out great for them. In any case, I'm just going to show you how I do it. Sometimes, I don't do it all the time, but in this case, we're going to do it. So we just got to push it up and use the palm of your hands, not your fingers. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a volcano up here, so it bends down here, which you don't want, because then when you push it down again, you're going to get clay over it and trap air. So you don't want that. Same thing when you push it down, you should really use your hand here and push it out like this, because otherwise you're going to get like a mushroom shape, and again this shape will then trap air underneath it. So you don't want to do that. So let's do it a few more times. What I like to do is use the strength of my right hand and hold it here, and use the left hand over it, connect the two hands always. I know some potters that do it like this. I can't do that. I do it like this to keep the strength, and then I pull it towards me. And then I kind of move my left hand from the top and down the side. The thing is, you don't actually need to worry too much about the inside of the clay ball. What you need is the outside of the clay ball to be centered. And you can do that by kind of shaping the side of it. And try and notice how little water I'm actually using. I know that some potters are splashing lots of water on it. The result is that you get water and mud all over the place. I'm trying to limit it as much as possible, and I'm going to use all the slip and apply that, so you get a slippery surface, but it's not wet and it doesn't splash all over the place. So now we have it pretty well centered. I like to take some of that slip away. The more clean you can keep it at this point, the less messy it's going to be later. So now we have a clay ball that is centered. Sometimes it's difficult to get the bottom of it completely centered. Don't worry too much about that. It's okay if the first centimeter or so is a little bit shaky. Because a lot of that is gonna be fixed once you start throwing, and also some of that is gonna be cut out anyway. So now we need to start with the most basic form that a lot of you are actually asking about, a cylinder. A cylinder is the basic form of most pots you will do. Whether you will do a vase, or you do a bowl, or a cup, or a pitcher, or anything, you would most often start with a cylinder. And then once you have the cylinder, you can start shaping it. The reason for this is that because of the power of the wheel, if you start out with a shape like this, then the power of the wheel is going to throw the clay around, and it becomes very difficult to control. A cylinder is a kind of a strong form, and especially if you cone it in a little bit, so it's a little thinner in the top than it is in the bottom, it's much easier to control. Now the difficult part with the cylinder is two things. First of all, you want to move enough of the clay at the bottom up through the cylinder, so you don't end up with nice thin walls here and then half of your clay ball sitting down here for no use at all. Because you don't want to end up with a pot that has too much clay down there. It's gonna crack in the drying or in the bisque fryer. So you wanna distribute the clay evenly up. That's one challenge. The other challenge is before you actually do the cylinder, you have to think about what shape you're going to end up with. If it's a bowl and you want to expand it a lot here, then you can't make it too thin at the top, because if you do that, then you won't have enough clay when you expand it. It will be too thin and it will break for you. If you want to do a vase and you want to do more like a moon jar type of vase or something where you have a heavy bottom and then a small neck, then you need to make sure you have enough clay here. In any case, you often end up with having to leave a little more clay at the bottom than what you would ideally end up with. That's okay, because you need enough clay at the bottom to support whatever you do in the top. Of course, if you're just going to do a straight up cylinder, and that's it, straight up cylinder vase, then you can distribute the clay completely like you want to have it in the end. But very often you're going to leave just a little more clay at the bottom than what you're going to end up with, and then you're going to cut it off or trim it later to get the thickness that you are aiming for. Throwing the cylinder involves two steps. First of all, we have now the centered clay ball, and now we're going to open it up, which is basically pushing down your finger or fingers, whatever way you like it. You can see how I do it. And once you make the hole down to the thickness of the bottom that you like, and we can talk about why to make it thicker or thinner, then you need to pull it. This is called when you're pulling the walls to make that cylinder. So let's move on with this. So I use my thumb, the first part of it. Now for a clay ball this size, my thumb is not big enough to reach the bottom. So then I move on with my left hand, and I support the side of the ball with my right hand, because when you start doing this, it's very easy to decenter the ball, and it will start wobbling around. Now I reach the bottom. That was my foam banging. I'm sorry about that. I reach the bottom. I think this is about the depth that I need, the thickness I need. So now I can start pushing out from the inside. I now push down and I open up the clay ball. You can't see inside it, but I think I reached about the thickness that I like, but I'm not 100% sure. So an easy way to check that is to use a potter's needle tool like this, and you push it down and you place your finger where it ends, and then you push it up, and as you see, this is way too thick. So I was completely wrong here, which happens a lot. So before I expand it more, because it's easy to make it thin when it's not so expanded yet, I will push down a little bit further. I will check again. Yeah, this is better. This is still a relatively thick button. But the reason for that, and that's what I said I would explain a little bit about, I like to trim my foot. And for that, I like to have a maybe 1.5 centimeter or something, so I can trim away about 1 centimeter and make this nice foot rim. Some potters don't like that, and they just want a flat button. In that case, you probably want to make it a little smaller, maybe only 0.5 centimeter or 7 millimeters. That would be better. But I like the foot, so I'm going to leave about 1.5 centimeter there. So now we know that the thickness of the button is the way it should be. So now I'm going to expand the button from the inside to the width that I want my cylinder to have. So the inside width of the clay ball is what you're going to be focused on. Don't focus so much on the outside, because when you pull that, you're going to thin it out anyway. In this case, I'm going to do a vase. So I think I need it to be a little larger on the button. So let's do that. So I think that's about the size that I want. The next part, and this is now that you have the opportunity to do that, you need to compress the button. Because you want the clay at the bottom to be as compressed as possible. That's gonna help you avoid cracking there. So I'm just going to use my fingers and kind of go back and forward over the button and kind of push the clay down. I'm not going to change the thickness. I'm just gonna compress it. Also, and of course you can't see that now from the side, but I also want to make sure that the walls are kind of 90 degrees, so that the button and the wall is about this. If it was a bowl, I might want to do it. I might want to do it a little more like this. But since it's going to be a vase, I want to have it on a 90-degree angle there. So now we have that basic shape in place. So now it's time to pull the walls. And this is a technique where you're pulling clay from the bottom all the way through the vase up until you reach the height you want. Of course, you can't do this in one pull. At least I haven't seen anybody who can do that. You're probably going to take a few pulls. Some potters will tell you that you can only do 2 or 3 pulls, then the clay gets tired and you can't do anymore. It's not my experience. But I will encourage you to learn how to do the pulling in just a few pulls. It does tend to get better results for some obscure reason. I don't know why. But so try and pull as much as you can without breaking it. The thing about pulling is that there's a million different ways. Some people like to use their knuckles like this and pull up. Some people use their fingers. I don't like that too much because I think you get an uneven surface. And some people, like me, prefer to use your thumb in in a backward position. This is a technique that can be very uncomfortable to begin with, but I found it to be very useful. I'm going to show you a variation of it that I also use when we get a little bit higher. The reason I found this useful for me is I do have a little bit of a nerve damage in this arm, so sometimes in some position, especially like this, I have a little bit of shaking, which makes some of the positions very difficult for me. So the reversed thumb is actually turned out to be the position that works greatest for me, which is like an important point because it doesn't really matter how you do it. What matters is what works for you and of course the end result. So let's move on with this. Before you start pulling, you got to make sure that the surface is slippery. You can use like the slip on the side to do that. Again, you don't want too much water, and especially not in this stage, because if it's too wet, the clay is not going to have as much power to hold itself. So the wetter it is, the more likely it is that it's going to mess up for you. So try and keep it wet enough to be slippery, but not too wet to lose all the strength. So let's do the first pull. And again, you got to go in under it in the bottom so you get enough clay there. In the first pull, I actually like to just use my fingers here. Gonna push them together and use this hand to support it. I can only do that for the first pull because the clay ball is not so deep yet, or the vase is not so deep yet, so I can do that. And every time I finish a pull, I always compress the rim, so make sure that you keep the strings. So that was the first pull that I did just with my fingers, just pushing them together. Now I'm going to move on to the reversed thumb. And sometimes it's easier if you just make a little groove down here to begin with, so you have something you can get your thumb in under. And remember, when you do these pulls, to support the walls the best you can, all the way up, and take it slow, don't rush it. What I find can be most tricky is when you pull, there's a tendency for the clay to go out, and you have to try and force it to go in. Now, as you see, in my case, it actually also goes out a little bit. So before I move on to the next pull, I actually just move it in a little bit up here. Because as I said, the wider it is at the top, the more it's going to be forced out, and you don't want that at this stage. Now I'm going to show you the second part of the reversed thumb technique that I was talking about. And again, this is just me. This is just because I have my handicap. You probably have your handicaps. We all have limitations. But as I said, when I'm bending my arm like this, it tends to shake a little bit. And that's, of course, not so good. You want to keep it stable. So what I find is, and very few potters actually do that. I haven't seen anyone do it. But I like to stand up when I do this, because that way I can stretch my arm. It also works great when I do really big pots. This one is not going to be so big, but when I do really big pots, I can't get into it if I'm sitting down. So I initially started using this stand-up method when I was doing very big pots, and then I found it actually works great even for smaller ones like this. So I'm just gonna slip it up a little bit so it's slippery, and also on the inside, just make sure that it's completely slippery. So that's it. Again, same thing, reversed thumb down here, get enough clay from the bottom, pull it up, what you should pay attention to is releasing slowly. If you release too fast, like this, then it's going to go like this. And of course, that's not very good. I can fix that again. So if you release slowly, you're not gonna mess up the pot. The difficult part I found one of the difficult parts when you're pulling a cylinder like this is to make sure that you have even walls. It's very easy to end up with a part of it being too thin. Like in the beginning, and still sometimes, I end up with this part. Funny reason, like 2/3 up, getting too thin. And when it does that, it doesn't have the strings to carry the top. So it starts wobbling, and then eventually have to cut it off there or something. So you've got to make sure that you get an even distribution of clay, so you have enough in the bottom to support the next part and so on. Ideally, you want something that is a little bigger in the bottom and then gets thinner up in the top. So I'm just going to do another pull here. Okay, at this stage, you're going to make a decision about the shape of your final pot, because what do you want to do with it? I do a lot of carving, so I cut out slices of the side, not going all the way through, but just on the surface. And if that's what you want to do, then you got to leave it pretty thick, otherwise you go through the walls of the pot. If you want just a very elegant, nice vase and just glaze it or something, then of course it needs to be a lot thinner than what this currently is, and you can pull it higher. If you want to do different textures, I also do that with sodium silicate or using a a comb or something to scratch the surface, like this one I often use, then you also need to leave enough room for that. And of course, if you want to expand it a lot, making a moon jar or something, you also need to leave enough clay for that. In this case, it's still too thick. I can still, pull clay, especially from the bottom, where it's probably almost 1.5 centimeter in the side, which is way too much. So we're going to do another pull. And we're already getting close to the 3 pull maximum that I was talking about, but this may be a good example of showing you that it doesn't actually have to be that way. So let's try another pull. Now, one of the things that you sometimes experience is that it's actually got too wide. It's nice that it's wide when you start working with your hands, but maybe you want to tighten it up a little bit, make it a little bit smaller, which is absolutely doable. This is something where we use the same technique as we used when we were coning up, but this time, of course, you have to watch out a little more because now you have a hollow surface here, or hollow cylinder. But this will actually also help create more height. Okay, so now we have a basic cylinder, and this was the main purpose of this exercise and what I want to show you. But of course, it's not going to stop here. I mean, of course, you could just leave this vase as it is, but I don't particularly like that one. So I'm going to do a bit more. Before you start doing anything, especially if you start closing up the top, you need to get the water out of the bottom. Because if you leave water there, of course it's not going to dry. It's going to dry on the outside, and that's going to leave cracks for sure. So before you start doing anything, make sure that you clean out the bottom with a sponge. So now it's nice and dry. So now we can start doing some shaping. And you have to decide now at this point what you want to do with this. In my case, I want to do a bit of a bellied vase, not like a moon jar, but a little bit of bellied vase, and moving into a nice narrow neck. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm probably going to speed it up in the video, but because this was basically about showing you how to do the cylinder, but I'm not gonna just leave this as it is. So I'm gonna go through and finish my ball so you can see what the end result is. So let's move on with that. The important thing is, if you want to make a vase with a neck, you've got to make sure that you leave enough clay at the top to do that. That's one of the mistakes that I made mostly in the beginning. When you color in the neck, there's a few things that you need to be aware of. First of all, of course, when you do that, the walls are going to be thicker. So ideally you would like to pull that up so they get a little thinner. Now, don't make them too thin, because that's going to make them wobbly. You can always trim off more when you get to a leather hard stage. That's going to make it easier for you. Also, the top is probably going to wobble or a little bit when you do this coloring in. It's very difficult to avoid that. Again, it's not a big problem. You can cut it off and make it even. I'll show you how to do that in a second. But when I started doing this, it was very difficult, and one of the most difficult things, I think. What I found is that I was actually being too gentle. You have to be a little bit firm. Go ahead and do it. And also you have to make sure that you kind of keep as even as support. Some use like a 6-point system, some use like a stroking handle like this. That's different techniques for that. But definitely you don't want to push it in a way so that it becomes like a triangle, because that's going to make it more uneven and difficult to control. I mostly use like a strangle kind of position, and then, well, I move it around a little bit. Working on the top, I try only to keep it wet up here and not wet it too much at the bottom, because again, as I explained in the beginning, if it's too wet, you're going to lose the strength of the clay. So I like to keep it only wet at the top. And of course I need a little bit of water on the inside, but just make small drips, because we don't want to fill up the bottom with too much water. Now, as you see, the top here is not completely even. And as I said, that's almost unavoidable, at least I can't. So to fix that, I use a very sharp knife and slow it down a little bit. Make sure that it's wet enough, otherwise it's going to stick. And just so. So, before I finish it, I like to use my metal rib to kind of scrape off the last remains of slip on the surface. That's going to help it dry a little faster and also make it a little more even and pleasant. So I think that's good enough for now. I'm not going to do any more now. I will trim it. As I said, the neck is a little bit too thick for my taste. I will trim it a little bit, and also I can trim this this part of it. And of course, I'm going to trim the foot. But the last thing I'm going to do before I finish is that I'm just going to cut out the excess clay that I had down here. It's going to make the trimming easier, basically. So, that's it. I'm going to cut it off and leave it to dry. Okay, that's it. I was focusing on showing you how to do the cylinder, but I ended up doing this small vase, kind of like that. I'm probably going to do some carving into this. I'm not 100% sure yet. I will determine that when I go to this trimming phase. So now I'm going to let it dry for 20 hours, 24 hours, maybe a little less, depending on the humidity in the air and how warm it's going to be outside. But tomorrow, probably, I will start doing some trimming and maybe some carving on it. I'll get back to that and maybe show you some of that at a later stage. I do have a lot more ideas for wreath-throwing videos that I'm going to put up soon. So I hope that you will subscribe to my channel, show you my support, show me your support, and also you will get notified about new videos. If you have any comments, please add them below, and I hope you have a good day.